A hot topic that's been circulating is that the trio of Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green is the greatest big three of all time. There's an argument to be made that they are the most successful, but for this video, we're going to go a little further. We are going to give the proper recognition to the players that had to be that quote-unquote third wheel. We're talking about players that were the third star on their team. For example, you think of players like Ray Allen for the Boston Celtics between 2008 to 2012, or you think of Chris Bosh for the Miami Heat between 2011 to 2014. LeBron James was Batman, Dwayne Wade was Robin, and Chris Bosh was Batgirl. I'm sorry, but that's the best cultural reference that I can think of. So the question is, which qualifying player had the most dominant season? We're not looking at the full body of work, but just a 1-year sample. And we're only looking for players that help their team win the title. Because if a team has a big three, then you should be expected to win it all. So let's find out which players was the greatest Batgirl of all time. At number 10, this might come as a surprise for a lot of you, but we're going to start with Horace Grant in the 1991-92 season. Here are the numbers that he produced in the regular season and the playoffs. His per game numbers might not look very impressive, but when you're the third scoring option behind a team that employs Michael Jordan, don't expect to see many shooting opportunities. But he was still a very respectable scoring option that other teams had to account for. When the defense would surround Michael Jordan or Scottie Pippen, there was Horace Grant at the elbow, and he was just automatic from anywhere within 20 feet. But it's his defense that hasn't gotten its proper due. He gave the Bulls so much versatility and athleticism. According to the assistant coach for the Bulls, Johnny Bash, he said this to the Chicago Tribune about Horace Grant in 1991, that he was the one that helped the most when they implemented the press defense. He was able to go the full 94 feet while also going down the court to cover his defensive assignment and still get the rebound at the end of the possession. The Bulls were always great at trapping the offense with Jordan and Pippen, but the fact that they had a big man that was able to cause problems anywhere on the court gave them so much versatility. He excelled at his role, which is why his advanced metrics look so good during this season. More specifically, his win shares is not only the highest mark from any player mentioned on this list, but he also finished with the third highest mark in the league. Think about how impressive that is from a player that wasn't considered to be an all-star that season. In the past, we have seen some all-time great players struggle when they were put in a role where they saw limited touches. Horace Grant thrived on it. He was the perfect piece for this team. That's why the Bulls in the early 90s were so dominant. Horace Grant deserves his roses. At number 9, we have Cedric Maxwell in the 1980-81 season. Here are the numbers that he produced in the regular season and the playoffs. Now this one's a little tricky. For that particular Celtics team, their big three consisted of Larry Bird, Robert Parrish, and Tiny Archibald. In fact, all three of those players made the All-Star team that season. So I'm in no way trying to say that Cedric Maxwell was their third best player. However, there are some stats that I'm just going to throw out there for you. He led the team in win shares that season. He was their third leading scorer during the season and their second leading scorer for the playoffs. So you can absolutely make the case that Cornbread Maxwell was one of the Celtics' most important and valuable pieces on this championship winning team. The ultimate proof of that came during their finals matchup against the Houston Rockets. Let me paint the picture for you. Larry Bird is struggling with his shot all series long. Then Tiny Archibald was playing hurt. He hurt his right thigh in Game 7 against the Sixers in the Eastern Conference Finals, and he was playing with essentially one good leg. And then Robert Parrish had his hands full trying to contain Moses Malone. So you can say that the Rockets had the Celtics right where they wanted them. But then Cedric Maxwell came to the rescue. With the series tied at 2 apiece, he led the way with 28 points on 10 of 13 shooting, 15 rebounds, 3 assists, and 2 blocks. He led the team in scoring that series, and he ended up winning the Finals MVP. Think about how impressive that is. I'm sure no one expected that this team would look to Cedric Maxwell to take on such a huge role in the finals. But he showed that he was more than capable of stepping up. I think his place on this list is well deserved. At number 8, we have JoJo White in the 1975-76 season. Here are the numbers that he produced in the regular season and the playoffs. Throughout the Celtics' dominating run in the early to mid-70s, their best two players were John Havlicek and Dave Cowens. For this season, Havlicek was 35 years old and wasn't producing quite as much on the scoring end. So the Celtics used a much more balanced attack on offense, which was largely due to the acquisition of all-star guard Charlie Scott. They had a total of 4 players that averaged over 15 points per game, but under 20 points. Once the postseason came around, JoJo White took on the scoring load and was their most consistent scorer. But the main reason why he makes this list is due to the fact that he won Finals MVP after the Celtics defeated the Phoenix Suns to win the title. His most important contribution came in the infamous 5th game that has been deemed as the greatest game ever played. He scored a game-high 33 points on 52% shooting. He also had 9 assists, 6 rebounds, and 2 steals in a triple overtime victory. He made so many timely buckets throughout this very intense game. In fact, nearly half of his points came during the 3 overtime periods. That is including this free throw that occurred before Gar Heard made the shot heard around the world that forced a 3rd overtime. It was such a legendary performance by this Hall of Fame player that was a big reason why the Celtics won the title. At number 7, we have Klay Thompson in the 2017-18 season. Here are the numbers that he produced in the regular season and the playoffs. Klay Thompson being the 3rd best player on a team just didn't seem fair at the time. When you have 3 players on the same team averaging over 20 points per game, then you know you have a team that can be accurately described as a super team. In fact, they are the only team of the 21st century to accomplish this. That's why it's no accident that this team had a historically great offensive season. That includes producing the 2nd highest effective field goal percentage and the 2nd highest true shooting percentage in NBA history for a single season. And you can bet that this sharpshooter had a lot to do with that record. And let's keep this other thing in mind. There are other players in this list that you'll see that also scored over 20 points per game. But in all of the cases, it's because they were the 2nd scoring option on the team. And in a lot of those cases, they had the greatest point guard in history, setting them up for easy baskets. In the case of Klay Thompson, he was the 3rd scoring option for the Warriors, and he was still able to post great numbers. So that makes his regular season numbers even more impressive. His numbers might have went down a bit in the playoffs, but we should highlight his performance against the Houston Rockets in the conference finals. He averaged 19.4 points per game for that classic 7-game series, and he also shot 49% from the 3. That includes his Game 6 performance when he went 9 of 14 from the 3 and scored 35 points. Like I said in the beginning, it just wasn't fair, and he had a lot to do with their dominance. At number 6, we have Byron Scott in the 1987-88 season. Here are the numbers that he produced in the regular season and the playoffs. When we think of the Showtime Lakers, we surely think of Magic Johnson, Kareem, and James Worthy. But in this season, Byron Scott climbed the ladder and was the Lakers' 3rd best player. Kareem was 40 years old during the time, so he was nothing but a glorified role player. Since he's not a marquee name for some NBA fans, he's been largely overlooked when discussing one of the greatest teams in the history of the league. But when you look back during this season, you will quickly realize how important he was for the Lakers. His most valued asset was his precision shooting from the outside, as he helped spread the floor when Magic was running the break. However, he was more than capable of dunking on just about anyone that dared try to contest his drive to the rim. He was an undersized shooting guard, but he was fearless when attacking the rack. The most important stat that demonstrates how important he was for the Lakers is that he was a leading scorer for the team that season, and he continued his strong play for the Lakers in the playoffs. His most notable performance came in Game 7 of the semifinal series against the Utah Jazz. He ended that game with 29 points on 63% shooting. He came up big for the Lakers multiple times during this playoff run. In fact, there was 3 different teams that pushed the Lakers to a 7th game, and every time, Scott scored over 20 points. The reality is that the Lakers wouldn't have won that title without him. At number 5, we have Tony Parker in the 2006-07 season. Here are the numbers that he produced in the regular season and the playoffs. So in my opinion, I believe that Tony Parker was the third best player for the Spurs during this time period. I say that because virtually every Spurs fan that I know says this to me. So if they feel that strongly about it, then I'm not going to be the one that questions it. The advanced metrics back that up, as the numbers indicate that Parker was the third most valuable player for the Spurs, behind Ginobili and Duncan. With that out the way, we can go straight to the point and mention why Tony Parker should enter the top 5. The main reason is because of his performance in the finals that led him to win the finals MVP. His 24.5 points per game average is the second highest from any player in this list. It brought some controversy to NBA fans when he was announced the winner, but I'm part of the camp that believed that he was deserving of it. As legendary as Duncan is, Tony Parker was the best player for that 4-game stretch. His penetration and clutch shooting were the keys to that series, and the Cavaliers had no answers for it. Just like it was in the case for JoJo White, winning the Finals MVP while being the third star on the team is a huge deal. It's something that is rare to see, especially when you have someone like Tim Duncan on your team. He might have struggled a bit for the first 3 rounds, but winning such a prestigious award gives us enough reason to rank him in the top 5. At number 4, we have Bob Dandridge in the 1977-78 season. Here are the numbers that he produced in the regular season and the playoffs. So I was trying to decide whether to choose this season for Bob Dandridge to appear on the list or the season in 1971. He was the third star on one of the greatest teams in NBA history, the Milwaukee Bucks. But that team had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Oscar Robertson, while the Washington Bullets in 1978 had Elvin Hayes and Wes Unseld. I think it's safe to say that Dandridge meant more to the Bullets than he did to the Milwaukee Bucks. Keep in mind that the Washington Bullets kept falling short in the playoffs in the 70s, and it seemed like they were always one piece away from finally ending the season with a title. So is it any surprise that they won their first title in franchise history in the same year that they acquired Bob Dandridge? The fact is that he had a lot to do with their success. Take for example his performance in the Eastern Conference Finals against the Philadelphia 76ers. The Sixers were heavily favored to win that series. The NBA world was expecting Dr. J to showcase his all-world abilities. However, he was largely contained throughout that series, and league observers have credited the defense of Bob Dandridge. Check out what an article from the Washington Post wrote in 1978 about that series. Bob Dandridge would like to believe everything he has read and heard about how he has been dominating pro basketball's Dr. Spectacular Moves, Julius Erving. Then it was written, Dandridge has frustrated Erving at least a couple of times in each of the first 3 games by batting away the ball at waist level as Erving is going up to shoot. And finally, it was written, he has been beating Erving down the floor on fast breaks. He has shot well, and he has repeatedly taken Erving down low and scored off him on one-on-one plays. End of quote. The numbers also back up what I just read. For the series, Dr. J averaged 21.5 points per game on 47% shooting, 9.3 rebounds per game, and 3.3 assists per game. Bob Dandridge averaged 22.8 points per game on 51% shooting, 6.3 rebounds per game, 4.2 assists per game, and 2 steals per game. The reality is that Dandridge outplayed one of the greatest players in NBA history in that series, and he was the main reason why the Bullets were able to advance to the finals. For me, that's more impressive than Tony Parker winning the Finals MVP against a Cavaliers team that had no shot at making that series competitive. So I give the slight edge to Bobby D. At number 3, we have Jamal Wilkes in the 1979-80 season. Here are the numbers that he produced in the regular season and the playoffs. So I've talked about Jamaal Wilkes in 2 different videos. I spoke briefly about him in the video where I talked about the most disappointing Lakers season of all time, and when I talked about the 1980 Lakers. I don't want to sound repetitive, but for me, we're talking about one of the most underrated players from that era. I personally love his game. he was very dangerous from the outside, and that helped spread the floor to allow Kareem to do his thing in the post. And he also had a great inside game. He was just a complete offensive player. And if you watched their first playoff game against the Phoenix Suns, the play-by-play announcers were calling him a top 3 player from the small forward position. If you look at the numbers, he has a pretty intriguing case. He averaged 20 points per game while shooting nearly 54% from the field. What more can you ask for from someone that's your 3rd best player on the team? As NBA.com described him, he personified the Lakers' up-tempo style because of his ability to score on the open court when Magic or Nixon would push the pace, and he was more than capable of scoring on the half-court setting. He was an extremely valuable piece to this team, which is proven by his win shares from that season. In fact, he was only one of 13 players to finish with a 10.0 win shares or higher. And as I mentioned in the video about the 1980 Lakers, his best performance of his career came in the title-clinching game when he scored a career-high 37 points against the Sixers in Game 6. We all know that Magic had an all-time great performance, but he wasn't a solo act. Jamal had a lot to do with that victory that led to a title. So that gives me enough reason to put him in the top 3 of this list. At number 2, we have James Worthy, the 1984-85 season. Here are the numbers that he produced in the regular season and the playoffs. Let's get one thing out the way. This is the only season where James Worthy will qualify for this list. From 1987 to 1991, James Worthy was the 2nd best player for the Lakers. All the numbers back that up. So that's why those seasons aren't included here. Now for the one season that he did qualify, which is this one, we're talking about a season that started his trajectory as one of the greatest players of all time. He made this team reach another level of dominance. In fact, I had the 1985 Lakers as one of the top 15 teams of all time. We'll get to in a second how James Worthy contributed to a team that had one of the greatest playoff runs of all time. But in the regular season, Worthy played his role to perfection within an offense that featured the greatest point guard at the peak of his powers and the greatest center of all time that was still a top 2 center in the league at the age of 37. That helped lead this team to 62 wins for the season. But in the playoffs, this team reached another level of greatness. They currently have the highest per game average for a single playoff run in NBA playoff history. They averaged a mind-blowing 126.3 points per game. And that's not including just teams that won the title. We're talking all the teams in the history of the league. But that's not all. They also shot the highest field goal percentage from a team that went farther than the first round. That is according to StatMuse. James Worthy had a lot to do with their high-power offense. We're talking about a player that scored over 20 points per game while shooting 62% from the field. He was unstoppable during the playoffs. And then in the finals, he averaged an impressive 23.7 points per game on 56% shooting against a tough Boston Celtics team. In some cases, that's good enough to get you a Finals MVP. But from a team's 3rd best player, those numbers are legendary. But at the number 1 spot, I'm picking Gail Goodrich in the 1971-72 season. From start to finish, I think this was the best season from a 3rd wheeler. Here are the numbers that he produced in the regular season and the playoffs. You remember what made this 1972 Lakers team so legendary, right? They won 69 games during the season, including winning a record 33 straight games. For a lot of people, we're talking about one of the 3 or 5 greatest teams of all time. So let's talk about first why he qualifies for this list. First off, we want to discuss the best 2 players on the team. I think we're all in agreement that it was Jerry West and Wilt Chamberlain. Jerry West was averaging over 25 points per game and averaging just below 10 assists per game. That's pretty legendary stuff. There's only been 6 players in the history of the league that have averaged at least 25 points and 10 assists, and Jerry West nearly was the 7th player. Then we have Wilt Chamberlain. Now it's true that Wilt was not one of the main scoring options for the Lakers. In fact, he was their 4th leading scorer. but his biggest contribution came in the defensive end. He was easily the game's best rim protector and one of the main initiators of that offense. It's very similar to the type of role that Bill Russell played for the Celtics, and he was usually their best player. And check out this next stat that helps prove our point. If you look at the advanced metrics, you'll see that Wilt Chamberlain was the most valuable player for the Lakers. And notice who is third on that list. It's Gail Goodrich. So that helps me reach to the conclusion that he was their third best player. And there's no question that he benefited greatly from playing alongside those legendary players. For example, check out what a New York Times article said about Goodrich in 1972. Quote, "Many of Goodrich's points are coming because Bill Sharman, the Lakers coach, has his team running more. Since Goodrich shoots best from close range, he is often able to sneak in for quick layups, especially when West is getting double teamed or when the opposition is sagging on Chamberlain inside." End of quote. That allowed him to be the leading scorer on arguably the most dominant team in the history of the league. That is something that we shouldn't be taken lightly. He's the only player from this list that averaged over 25 points per game for the season. And thanks to his scoring prowess, Wilt Chamberlain even called him the star of the team. So there's no question that Goodrich played a huge role for a team that has the third best record in the history of the league. Now the biggest stat that we can use to make his case for being number one on this list is how he performed in the finals. He had the highest scoring average out of all the players from that series, as he averaged 25.6 points per game on 47% shooting against a tough defensive team. That is also the highest scoring average from all the players in this list. But he didn't win Finals MVP. It was Wilt Chamberlain, the second best player on this team. So his scoring production on one of the greatest teams in the history of the league makes me believe he's worthy of this spot. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what your list would be on the comment section. Thanks for tuning in. Till next time.